Welcome back to Odyssey of a Teenage Dirtbag, the true story of how a kid who once had nothing, no direction, and no shot built a life worth living. If you're new here, I'm glad you found us. If you like what you hear this episode, I encourage you to go back and check out the story from the very first. This podcast is about what it really takes to climb out from rock bottom and why that's always possible. I'm your host, Michael. Let's get into it. This is episode 6, Amor de los tiempos de caos. I spent my free time between lesson planning walking down to El Estadio, the stadium, where there was an outdoor gym and a skate park along with a full-size track and field. I hadn't brought many things down with me, but amongst my most precious were my skateboard and my guitar. I spent most of my long hours down at the skate park hammering the grind rails or busting up my body trying to stick a perfect landing. I developed some confidence in applying myself to anything I wanted to learn through applied perseverance, like spinning basketballs. And so it was the same with skateboarding for me. I would hammer a rail and over until I would eventually stick the trick. Over time, I developed a handful of small runs at the local park and added a few new tricks to my wheelhouse. The skate park was a regular source of joy for me. On one of my walks home from skateboarding at the stadium, I was caught in a sudden torrential rainstorm. Now, the rainstorms in Mexico are something else, not quite like something you'd see up in the States, at least not for me. Now, I'd brought my cell phone with me from the States, and it was really my only connection to life at home. I'd mostly maintained contact with Madison through daily texts. I was rather taken by her after leaving. You know what they say, absence makes the heart grow fonder, or something like that. And our messages were romantic, and she was starting to preoccupy my running thoughts each day. I'd even written down, a handwritten letter to her, spilling out all my affections and placing a dried flower inside as a memento of my love. And I'd sent it to her, hand-mailed to the States. And so it was all very romantic. But our contact ended abruptly after that monsoon that day. Stormwater formed rivers in the street, and all I could do was run back home and hope for the best. By the time I made it to my apartment, I opened my backpack to reveal my phone floating in several inches of water that had sort of welled at the bottom of the bag. My phone was ruined, and now I had internet connection, and I could access that at the church office. But at the time, Facebook wasn't really a thing yet, and MySpace wasn't really a thing anymore. So it was in this intermittent period where I found myself without a connection. And I'd found out later that she'd started dating a boy stateside, and so I assumed that all happened around when my phone broke, unfortunately. But once I was no longer talking to Madison, I obviously needed a new crush. I was sort of interested in Priscilla, who was a girl who worked at the church. She was very pretty and had a sort of sophisticated je ne sais quoi about her, but she was way out of my league, and I knew it, and she knew it. But that didn't stop me from trying. There was a local game called Boleto 21 or something like that, where you could trade a kiss with someone if you found a bus ticket where the 4 or 5-digit numbers at the bottom added up to a total sum of 21. So I spent several weeks riding the bus around town and saving my tickets each time, adding up and counting the numbers, hoping I had the magic number. And once I finally got a 21 ticket on my bus ticket, I remember just running over in my mind how I would offer it to Priscilla for a kiss. But my plan didn't go over quite how I'd hoped. I approached her after finishing teaching for one evening, and she was alone. Normally there's a few other women in the office, and so I was grateful that they were gone in the moment. And she was working on some paperwork after hours, and so I went in and offered to trade my highly prized ticket in exchange for only a small trifle. A kiss would do. She laughed and looked at me asking who told me about the game and took my ticket from me. And right around that time, I could hear the snickers from the other room as several of the other girls were eavesdropping in and laughing at my failed attempt. So I asked finally, I'll take that as a no. Uh, it's a no, she said, smiling and turning away and returning to her work for the day. Uh, I kept my crush on Priscilla for a while, but eventually she started dating a local musician in a rock band, and I couldn't compete with him, so I moved on to greener pastures and seemed more at my my level. It was around that time that I met Araceli. Harrison and his roommate Lillian were quickly turning their friendship into a budding romance. One time before they started dating, we were all at a local bar called The Zoo, and I tried to kiss Lillian casually, I remember, and she curbed me right away, quickly looking over to Harrison. And I pretty much knew after that moment that she liked Harrison. And I liked both Harrison and Lillian quite a bit. And I was happy when they started dating. So it was fun as we kind of went on more adventures, all of the three of us. And Lillian was working at a local school for children with severe developmental disabilities. And they also had, kids there with physical disabilities as well. And that was part of her volunteer programming. She would essentially help with the daily care and programming at this organization called Niños de Luz or something like that. I can't quite remember the name. Anyways, there was this local girl who did the art programming there and was around our age. And so Lillian had invited her to come along with us for the day trip out to Sayulita, which was about a 2-hour bus ride north of Puerto Vallarta. And Sayulita was a pretty fantastic town. It was like a great way to spend the day away from the city. The whole beach was like this giant shallow bay where these incredible waves would roll in at a really steady pace, making for excellent surfing and just general water sports. There wasn't really any large hotels or really big buildings in the downtown area, at least at the time. So it really felt like a small kind of town, like a Pueblo little style town that you would see in an old Hollywood movie, like Three Caballeros or Saludos Amigos or something like that. Anyways, we all planned on taking a bus from Vallarta to Sayulita, and we were all to meet at the bus stop and then ride off together. When I first met Araceli, I wouldn't say that she was exactly my type. She was a little plainer than most of the girls I was used to going after, but she was kind and fit. And we talked the whole bus ride up about her work at the school and how she enjoyed helping the kids she served. And she was a big fan of music generally and had interest in a few genres that I also liked. And so we all spent much of the ride just talking shop about different bands we all liked and why. And all in all, it was just a pleasant time. It was fun to be with them on the trip up there, and we were all really connecting socially in an organic way. Once we arrived in Sayulita, we all just dressed down to our swimsuits and headed to the beach. I used the opportunity to get closer to Araceli, and we ended up holding hands through a few waves as they sort of crashed through us in the waist-deep water. And after swimming, we went back onto the shore and started eating a small picnic that the girls had packed. And Araceli and I were sort of paired off, and Harrison and Lillian were kind of doing the same. And there was this moment during our picnic when I thought she was leaning in for a kiss. And so I leaned in to try to kiss her back. And she winced and shook her head, putting her hand over her mouth. And so I was thinking, wow, God, I can't read books or women. It felt like the bus ticket rejection all over again. I seemed to just walk right into it. Later, she told me that she'd slipped forward while being in the middle of chewing some chili salsa and couldn't bear to embarrass herself, trying to kiss me with food in her mouth. But I hadn't noticed that at the time, and it felt like I'd overplayed my hand. But we all spent the afternoon walking around town and returned to the beach by sunset. Araceli and I walked together along the shoreline, under the night sky. And, I reached over and took her hand, and hers slipped into mine, and we walked like that in the silence. The stars were bright, and the wet sand reflected their glow. The ocean waves soothed me as each wave rolled in to the shoreline that night. I was sort of raptured in that moment. I was taken somewhere else. Eventually, we both walked back to meet Harrison and Lillian, and together we all returned to the bus stop and waited for the next bus south to Vallarta. And when the bus arrived, we were among the only passengers, aside from a few tourists and a pair of drunks with a bottle of tequila. And the drunks made their way around the bus, moving from passenger to passenger, offering to pour a few shots of tequila straight into their mouths that night. And our group accepted the gesture, and we all sort of guzzled a few messy shots of this cheap tequila before settling in for the long ride home. And the bus was dark, and the lighting that ran the length of the aisle was dim. There was the smell of tequila in the air mixed with perfume. And I remember Araceli was sitting beside me and leaning on my shoulder, and she looked up at me, and our eyes met. And then in the darkness, we kissed. She tasted like tequila. And when I finally came up for air and returned to the view of the bus, Harrison was sort of smiling at me and giving me a thumbs up. Araceli returned her head to my shoulder, and we rode back in silence all the way back to town. We all dropped Araceli off at her stop and waved goodbye before heading on another few stops to our own. After we left the bus, Harrison and Lillian left for their own apartment, and I walked the rest of the way home alone. There was like a feeling in the air. It was like the shifting of seasons. Suddenly things would be different between us all. Surely for the better, but different nonetheless. Araceli became a routine guest after that for our nights out at the zoo or for late evenings at the pool hall playing billiards. She and I were growing closer as well. And by that time, I'd been able to convince my overlords at the church to pay for me to have a cell phone. So I wasn't without communication during an emergency, was what I alleged. My newly minted phone meant that I had the ability to stay in better contact with Araceli, though. And so we just grew closer by the day. Eventually, I asked her to be my girlfriend, and there wasn't any pomp or circumstance to it. We just went out for a night of dancing with Harrison and Lillian and returned to their apartment to sleep it off. And they left us alone on the couch after going to bed, and we just discovered ourselves in the darkness. We exchanged gentle kisses and then fell asleep. Sometime the next morning, I asked her if she would be my girlfriend, and she agreed. We parted ways for the day, and I went off to town to visit a friend who was in town from the States, actually, and was staying at a nearby resort with his family. Now, visiting Brian and his parents at the local resort was one of my favorite days. They'd booked one of these really fancy places by the airport for their annual family vacation, and it was just a total escape from the day-to-day grind. I had forgotten altogether about this world of tourism that was hustling and bustling along these beaches and resort properties year-round. My apartment was far off and near the big tunnel that led out of the city, and my daily walk to the stadium or my car rides up to the Volcanics district never really brought me near the tourist areas, or not often enough to really be forward and present in my mind. But that day, it took me a while to even gain access to the resort because there was this whole process with security about needing like a proper room key number and all that before they would even let you walk in. And it was a sign of my improving Spanish and my tanning complexion that they actually gave me some grief initially at entering the property. Rather than assuming I was one of the usual rabble immediately, they had kind of asked me a few questions, to shake me down. And I remember stepping onto the resort finally after making it through security and feeling like I just walked into the pearly gates of heaven. Uh, you know, it was incredible to behold, really. We were in this giant Mayan temple themed hotel. It was like the first time I'd ever been in a resort up close like that in my life. And honestly, I was awestruck at the enormity and just the sheer lavishness of it all. Brian's family really rolled out the red carpet for me and just afforded me any luxury that the resort could offer. We rode jet skis, we ate poolside, we ordered room service, we swam in lagoons, we rode water slides. It was an absolute treat. I hadn't had any Americans to talk to either for a while, so it was just nice to catch up and see how things were going in the States. The presidential race was shaking up, apparently, and this guy, Barack Obama, was looking like a Democratic front runner. And so, all in all, it was just interesting to connect and hear how things were going. Even if just for a day. His parents gave me cash to spend on myself, and they took me out for a final dinner before leaving back home. The whole thing sort of snapped me back into reality that I had an entire world I'd left behind. The Thanksgiving holiday arrived, and it was a strange experience to celebrate while in another country. It was also the first time I'd been alone and away from family for the holiday, especially in a place that really didn't celebrate it. I'd asked around for somewhere or something to do, but was coming up short. Absent a few handful of restaurants at a few of the hotels, no one even cooked a special meal for Thanksgiving. A friend at my local church, Uvia, owned a restaurant at a hotel an hour or so south of Vallarta in a little oceanside village called Miss Maloya. And she'd invited me to eat at her restaurant that day and promised that they would try to do something festive. And so I went, and Miss Maloya was an interesting place. It's sort of like this captivating little jungle town nestled along the Pacific with these great rocks that are set out from shore that look like these giant turtles. Kind of like in Aladdin and the King of Thieves, where there was like a whole city carried atop the back of a turtle. That's what they looked like to me. But the beach there had some weird erosion issues, and year over year it was disappearing more and more. I remember seeing pictures from the 70s and then pictures from the beach around the 2000s, and it had receded by hundreds of yards. But the resort there was nestled amongst the rocks high or along the shoreline, and that's where Uvia's restaurant was located. And so I went and enjoyed some, homemade soup, and I tried to celebrate the holiday, world away from anyone who really cared. So Thanksgiving came and went, and I felt homesick. I didn't have a cell phone that could connect calls to the U.S., as my Telcel cell phone was really only good for local calls, so I wasn't able to speak with my family often. I was able to speak with them intermittently if I used special cards and used the phones for international calling. I could get an international call card, but it was infrequent when we communicated. And most of the communication occurred really through email, or when Mike Parker would come to visit operations in Mexico and check in on how things were going, I would use his phone. But I did receive mail from time to time, and my mom was able to send me a few care packages that included scented candles and tea. I remember lighting the pine-scented candles that first Thanksgiving that I'd spent alone, and the memory of home really set in. I was in this foreign place, and the closest thing I had to home was the smell of pine trees. And I savored that candle and just slowly sipped my tea until I didn't have any more. My roommates were all, for the most part, good sports. They were all Mexican guys from various corners of the country. Each had their own purpose for being down there or for taking work with the church. In particular, I bonded really with my roommate, Javier. He had been separated from his wife and daughter in Colorado after he was picked up in an immigration sweep at a construction site. He showed me a picture once that he'd saved of a local newspaper cutout where the front page there was this group of migrants detained and sitting in handcuffs in front of a white immigration bus while ICE agents stood alongside. And he pointed at one of the men sitting in handcuffs wearing a Colorado Rockies ball cap and said, "See, that one's me." He had a sense of pride in looking at that picture. I remember. I think he was just proud to have been in the newspaper for really anything. But he saved the paper and showed me that day, and I enjoyed seeing it. He told me that when his wife had learned, though, of his plight, and how he had been forced to return to Mexico, that she told him that she'd preferred to stay in the U.S. rather than reunify with him in Mexico. And so he had to watch his daughter be raised from afar. And he'd come to work at the church, I think, to help the local food program as a way to try to find some purpose in his life after such a significant personal loss. Javier would help me with my Spanish and would speak patiently with me. And at times he would ask if I minded if he spoke to me in English. Of course, I never cared, and we would help each other together. I told him about many of my struggles in life and the challenges that I had faced in getting there, and he would listen with empathy and encourage me to keep working hard and trusting in God. He would try and remind me that through faith, all things were possible. Eventually, Javier went on his own way and continued on his journey somewhere else. But I will never forget the kindness he shared with me by just listening. I hope wherever he ended up, that he was able to see his daughter again. Navidad, or Christmas in Mexico, had its own special kind of magic. The decorations were different. The festivities were different. The evenings were often hallmarked by parades of parishioners to the local churches, and warm, spiced cider was served in Mass. Leading up to the holiday, I'd spent most of my time with Araceli, Harrison, and Lillian, but for Christmas itself, I'd traveled by bus to this little town a bit north of Vallarta, where Araceli was from, to spend Christmas at her family's house. The town itself was very small, and I can't remember the name. I still can't recall it to this day. But there was bumpy little dirt roads that led around the town in a large circle, and they were surrounded by rows of these small brick and cement houses with this old Catholic church at the center of town. A few little houses were converted to tiendas, with one of Araceli's nearby aunts running one of the shops. We went inside to buy some aspirin for her brother that night, and it was really just a living room that had been converted to a store, with these meager shelves sort of lining the walls and holding everything from bottles of wine to mouthwash and cigarettes and cell phone cards. I'd had a slight toothache that night, and so I'd purchased some whole cloves to chew on, a remedy that one of the locals had shown me a few weeks prior. And Araceli introduced me to her parents that night. Both were quaint individuals who spoke no English. And also to her brother, who was just a really sociable gay guy, a few years older than me. Araceli showed me her room upstairs, and we promised her parents that we would sleep in separate beds that night. Later that evening, we all went out to a nearby Christmas party where an outdoor barbecue was taking place. I met many of Araceli's extended family at that party, and they were all really friendly folks. Each was a bit more country or vaquero in how they carried themselves than some of the folks nearer to the city. They were all just a little bit wilder in a way. But they cooked some carne asada over hot coals and drank Corona as music played in the background. And it's just a nice time. I remember there was a few trucks parked with their doors cracked open, and they were playing banda music or corrido or something in between. And it was just a good time. And there was a mood in the air, though. Araceli's family was very accommodating of me, very friendly, very gracious people. But I don't know that I felt exceptionally welcome at the family party or even at her house for Christmas that year. I think they all just viewed me as a future heartbreak. And so they looked at me with sort of sadness for someone they loved. I don't think that was unfair of them or an unfair assessment of my place in the way of things, but it was an almost tangible feeling. That kind of feeling that you could just pull out of the air and squeeze for a few moments before it slipped through my fingers. Later that night, Araceli and her parents and her brother all returned with me to her house. We drank some spiced wine and talked in Spanish over Christmas memories and differences in our personal traditions. Around midnight, we walked down to the nearby church together in a small procession with the other townsfolk. Upon arriving at the church, it was full to bursting, and there was no room inside for us. But we could see candles on stage being lit and could hear the echoes of a sermon from an amplifier positioned near the door. And in a resuscitation akin to Linus from Charlie Brown's Christmas, the priest recited from the book of Luke the story of Christ's birth on Christmas night and how he'd come to save the world and redeem us from our sins. In that moment, on the sweetness of Christmas night, hearing those words in another language and translating them into my mind, into my heart, I really felt a sense of relief wash over me. Like maybe I was a fuck up. Maybe I had fucked up my whole life with one bad decision after another. But that maybe through salvation I had a chance at my own redemption. Maybe if God could forgive me, I could forgive me too. And then the service ended, and so I buried the thought away, and we walked slowly back to Araceli's house with the fading sounds of Christmas coming from each of the nearby homes. We didn't go to sleep right away after that. Rather, we stayed up, Araceli, myself, and her brother, while her parents turned in. But the rest of us could feel this strange mood in the air, and we weren't ready to let it go. So we drank more wine and stayed up for a few more hours. Eventually we went out and walked the streets in silence in the darkness of early morning, with no real regard for whether Santa would catch us away from our beds. We walked the evening streets and just enjoyed the quietness and stillness of night, each warm with the flush of wine and, leaning into that strange feeling that comes on a Christmas night. We later went to bed and Araceli laid with me while I fell asleep, and then I heard her creep back over to the other bed in the upstairs room before she let sleep take her. We awoke to a simple breakfast of eggs, beans, and fresh tortillas, and I took the bus home later that day. As with other holidays in Mexico, it was my first Christmas away from family. I had a little bit of pine-scented candle left, and that was the closest thing around to a Christmas tree. Javier and my other roommate, Gabrielle, were home when I arrived, and we toasted to Christmas and said a simple prayer together. And I returned to my small room and tucked in my air mattress for sleep. I stared at the orange tile of the room and the white walls while thoughts of home washed over me. I thought of my family and the distance between us. I laid awake and thought about all the choices and all the decisions that I had made that led me here. I felt like I was on the right path, like I was headed in the right direction with my life. And I sincerely felt that to be true. I thought about my life in Mexico and if I could carve a way forward. Somehow in that moment, I just knew I didn't love Araceli in the forever kind of way. I knew I wasn't ready to mentally make that commitment with her. And I thought about how I would even find work in Mexico if I wanted to make a life there, as $50 a week wasn't really sustainable indefinitely. I had limited education, limited financial resources, and I lacked connections to seek different employment opportunities. Things were also coming to a head with the church overlords, and so that was always present in my mind. I woke up and worked hard every day. I was putting in significant effort into preparing lessons and still making the rounds on the truck to pick up food donations every day. I helped welcome new volunteers and introduce donors to daily operations when new ones flew in, and I was just passionate about doing good work and looked to every new day for more opportunities to do meaningful work around me. But I just couldn't seem to shake that first impression I'd made with a select few of the church's leadership team for all my efforts. They had an image of me in their mind, and they weren't interested in changing it, no matter what I did. As I saw it, I had matured immensely from the boy who had stepped off the plane. I was working very hard for limited pay in challenging conditions to try and do some good for the kids I taught. The overlords just didn't care. Eventually, I sort of learned to disregard the judgment from the overlords because the people I worked with on a day-to-day basis expressed consistent gratitude for my efforts and saw the hard work that I did. I felt appreciated by the people who mattered. Kids from the school would see me in the community and run up to give me a high five and practice their English with me, each wearing smiles every time, and Harrison continued to teach and work with me in the classroom, and we saw considerable development in the students we served. And that was in spite of all the challenges in just the environment that we worked in. For example, the school we taught at routinely had power outages from copper theft, and the only running water that was available was from a large cistern up the hill. So the children weren't able to clean up for meals or even after bathroom time. And depending on whether or the time of year, darkness interrupted hours of instruction at many times of the day. And so I also, used some of my own stipend if I needed to purchase additional classroom resources. I was just committed to the kids and committed to the work, even though there were challenges in providing optimal education. One of the hardest things, though, was really that the children were just not consistent in attendance due to often being required to assist their parents at the dump, digging through trash, or collecting cans to trade for a few extra pesos. It's really hard to teach a group of kids when every day your classroom has a handful of different faces in it. But there were a few regulars who came every day, and maybe your 20 or so kiddos who just came ready and prepared to learn. And so watching those kids grow just made it all worthwhile. The timing was pretty ripe, though, for things to go wrong. I'd become so adept at focusing on my work and otherwise ignoring the overlords that the next shakeup really caught me off guard. One of the guys dating Harrison's rude Scottish roommates had some cool Aztec-themed tattoos that were really well done. And so I'd asked him where he'd had the work done. He said he had it done at a place called Chapa Tatuaje down in Old Town. So I went down to scope it out. And when I arrived, it was hot and it was the middle of the afternoon. The door was this roll-up style metal storefront that had already been lifted open for the day. And behind it was a single chair studio with a small back room. And there was flash art that had lined the wall and some really ghostly oil paintings that hung on the wall, painted in a style that I would say is reminiscent most of Salvador Dali. The tattoo artist Chapa was working on some new oil painting at the time, similar to those that were already hanging on the wall, and I settled in to chat him up. I told him I was living nearby and teaching at the local shop or local school, and that I had seen some of his tattoo work around town. And he thanked me for coming by, and he'd offered to give me a tattoo for a discount if I ever wanted something done. I was a 19-year-old kid at the time, and tattoos hadn't totally spread into the mainstream of popular culture yet. Like tattoos were still mostly reserved for punk rockers, skateboarders, motorcycle clubs, and any other folks associated with fringe culture, kind of living on the border of society. So naturally, I was drawn to the idea of getting some tattoos. And I drew out a few ideas that I'd wanted. I used the money that Brian's parents gave me and some other petty cash that I had set aside by saving $1 or $2 a week to get my first tattoo. I ended up getting several more after the first, and most of my tattoos after that were all coverable with a t-shirt, and so the overlords were blissfully unaware of my indiscretions. Eventually, I wanted, though, to get a sleeve, which is, a tattoo that covers most of your arm. And the first section was going to be my quarter sleeve that was for my shoulder and bicep portion. I had brought Chappa some pictures of this Celtic knotwork, and he drew up this really cool piece of scroll work with these kind of twin Celtic dragons, paying homage to my Irish heritage. And so the tattoo took about 2 sessions. The first was this 8 or 9 hours of mostly line work, and then the second was probably 4 or 5 hours of shading. And I'd only had one movie to watch that I'd purchased from a bootleg vendor a few weeks before. So I remember I set up my laptop and just watched over and over again I Am Legend to pass the time while he worked on my tattoo. And God, I remember watching that poor dog die enough times for a lifetime. But when all the work was finished, Chappa rubbed some Lubriderm lotion into the fresh ink and then covered it up with saran wrap and a few rubber bands. Unfortunately for me, when I was leaving the shop, I ran into one of the overlords from the church who was leaving their lunch at the restaurant next door with a colleague. And he looked over my tattoo very disappointedly. But just went along his way and didn't say anything to me. And I wondered if I would hear about it later. And oh boy, did I hear about it later. I went to work later that day, and about 2 inches of my new tattoo was visible below the arm line of my t-shirt. And I was wearing this kind of polo shirt with short sleeves and a pair of khaki shorts at the time. And I remember outrage just rippled amongst the group of overlords who were eating lunch at the church at the time when I arrived. They wasted no time in telling me that I was setting a really bad example for the students I served, and that the children would think tattoos were cool and acceptable by seeing me with them and later find themselves unemployable with tattoos all over their bodies. And maybe they were right. Maybe I was setting a bad example for impressionable kids who could face some challenges in future employment in a heavily touristed area and resort-based industry in the context of, cultural norms at that time. And maybe 10 years from that time, those kids would rest all of their decision-making and getting a tattoo based on the fact that their super cool ESL teachers from 10 years ago had one too. Just maybe. But I didn't want to see it that way. And so the overlords asked me to go home and to come back to work in a long-sleeved shirt or to put on a sweater that they happened to have available. Now, it was springtime in the southern hemisphere, and the temperature was already very warm. Additionally, I didn't have a car, and I relied on my own feet to take me where I needed to go. So I was really reluctant to put on a sweater, and I might even have outright refused. Okay, I outright refused. We agreed to a compromise that resulted in me rolling up the sleeves on my dress shirt, and I went to work angry for the next several weeks with rolled up sleeves. Meanwhile, things with Araceli had really kind of plateaued for me. She was madly in love with me, but I couldn't see myself there. I just didn't see a future in Mexico. I didn't see a future with her. We would go out for dates or dinner, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. She was still a virgin, and I didn't want to take things to the next level if I wasn't emotionally invested, and I really wasn't. So we were at this crossroads in our relationship. And I think she wanted me to ask her to do it. And I think she would have done it. But I didn't want that hanging over my conscience if I wasn't staying around. And so I didn't. And so we sort of stayed in this relationship purgatory for a little bit. Harrison went back home. His time and tenure with the study program had ended, and it was time for him to travel back to England, where he was from. Lillian was to be leaving a few weeks after Harrison, and they intended to reunite when they'd both returned to London. Once we had all went out one last time to a little bar on the corner of their apartment street. I remember I bought some super duper cheap tequila from the corner store, the kind that was like sold in a plastic bottle. And we just drank the whole thing. We smiled and laughed and shared stories about how each of our memories had developed there. Harrison had these Velcro shoes that would drive his roommates mad each time he would loudly rip off the straps. And they took them ransom early on and refused to return them until he had exchanged them for a feather of a phoenix, Bono's sunglasses, and a variety of other very rare items. I'm not sure how the final trade went down, but those moments were already turning into memories long past. His time to go home had come, and I remember hugging him that night, saying goodbye to him, and it felt like I'd lost my best friend in the whole world. And in some way, deep down inside, I knew I'd probably never see him again. It was around that time that Mike Parker came to town. He'd flown into Puerto Vallarta because he had some separate business, but the overlords were complaining about me, and he was going to make the most out of the trip. So he was, a major financier of the operations down there, so he always sort of received red carpet treatment whenever he came to town. This time he wanted to have a tough talk with me, a sort of man-to-man chat about my tattoos and how they were bothering the church. Also, there was this issue from when I had called a local cook estúpida during an argument about said tattoos. I wasn't really aware that estúpida is some sort of really serious insult type swear in Mexico. I just thought it was like a simple negative colloquial like in English. So when Mike communicated that the church was very upset with me for my language, I was surprised and also uninterested in their feelings. I told Mike after we spoke that I thought it would be best for me to just head home. I felt like at that point I had served my purpose there. And I didn't know that much more time in the environment was going to do any good, especially in an environment where I wasn't appreciated or respected as an individual. Mike was pretty patient with me, and he tried to explain, the cultural differences in Mexico with respect to piercings and tattoos, and that they meant well even if they didn't come across that way. And I don't think I heard too much of it. I was still a kid. I was still trying to figure it all out. So I called my dad later that night and asked if he and my mom could put some things together for me to get a plane ticket out of there. They agreed to get me a flight back to Seattle within the next month or so. And so I remember I told Araceli I was leaving. She was crushed. She asked if I wanted to keep things going long distance. And I said I thought it was best if we just ended contact to make the separation easier. She called me just one time from Mexico after I'd arrived back home. She was crying and said she missed me, and I could hear a friend of hers kind of in the background consoling her, just barely. I didn't have anything to say other than that I was sorry. But that didn't stop her tears. And when I ended the call, my heart broke for the pain I'd caused her. I mean, heartbreak is an inevitable part of life. And I don't know that there was anything different I could have done. I knew my life wasn't in Mexico, and my life wasn't with her. But in that moment, it was chilling for me. It haunted me for some time, even after the echoes long passed. Thanks for listening to Odyssey of a Teenage Dirtbag. Every episode is another piece of the story. Proof that no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back up. If this episode meant something to you, share it with someone you know. Like and subscribe below if you haven't already. Until next time, keep chasing the life you were meant to live.